Well, now I understand. Now I understand what Peter meant by saying he was reluctant to interrupt the conversation. Can I just say that I have waited 3 years, since December of 2019, to ask you all the question I love to ask at this award, which is everybody having a good time? Well, this is how we party at Phi Beta Kappa. Now, I have to tell you, we do not have the Prince and Princess of Wales. Some people think that's a plus, but we're not going to get into that. We have better, because whereas what they have to give will someday fade, a book will never fade and will never leave you. Yeah, that was pretty good, I got to admit. And it's not even in the script. When we celebrate with our book awards for a good and certain reason, because we understand that a liberal education, which is, after all, what our 3 prize-winning books really would be. If you read all 3 of our books, back to back to back, one in the humanities, one in the social sciences, one in the natural sciences, that is a kind of liberal arts curriculum all in itself each year. And we know that a liberal education prepares us, yes, for a productive life, Uncle John, and for meaningful lives and for engaged lives as citizens. And that is what brings us here each year to celebrate the book awards, but to be back in person is a very, very special thing indeed. I am delighted to have us here for the 2022 book awards. I will, as Peter mentioned, shortly have the great honor of engaging in conversation with one of our honorees tonight, Professor Farah Griffin. I regret that our other 2 honorees cannot be with us tonight for personal reasons, but we will have a chance to celebrate them, and I am pleased to tell you that we will continue the tradition we started some years ago of having one of the episodes of the Key Conversations with Phi Beta Kappa podcast with all 3 recipients. When I offered them the awards and told them that this was one of the opportunities that they had, each one said, Farah, I don't think you know this, each said exactly what you said, which was, I can't wait to meet the other 2. And so you will, albeit on a screen, and we will do the podcast, so you'll want to be listening out for that. But tonight we will have the opportunity to engage in conversation with one. Let me first take a point of personal privilege and thank the members of the Phi Beta Kappa team who make not only this happen tonight, but make the mission of Phi Beta Kappa happen every day. Could I please ask the members of my team to please stand and be recognized? Now, for some reason, when I said that, the folks from the American Scholar did not stand, so we're going to fix that right now. Shyness. Suda, don't forget, I'm a former law professor. I know how to cold call on people, so. I would also like to thank the members of the Book Awards Selections Committee, who I think you will all agree have made excellent choices yet again this year. I also want to thank all the members of the Secretary Circle who are present, and all those members of the Secretary Circle not present tonight. Your support means the world to all of us and helps further the mission of the Phi Beta Kappa Society. The first prize that I want to award tonight in absentia is the Phi Beta Kappa Award in Science. The Science Prize was established in 1959 to encourage literate and scholarly interpretations of the physical and biological sciences and mathematics. The winning title of the Phi Beta Kappa Award in Science is The Disordered Cosmos, A Journey into Dark Matter, Space-Time, and Dreams Deferred by Chanda Prescod Weinstein, published by Bold Type Books. The disordered cosmos is precisely the the kind of book that the Science Prize was designed for back in 1959. She has given us a bold new approach to science and society, beginning with the simple and profound belief that we all have a fundamental right to know and love the night sky. Think of that tonight when you leave here. I hope it's as clear as it was last night. Those of you who were in Washington last night, you know, we don't see a lot of stars in Washington, at least not the ones up there. But last night was a surprisingly clear night, and I thought of this book when I saw that last night, that we all have a fundamental right to know and love the night sky. Professor Prescod Weinstein shares her love for physics, from the standard model of particle physics and what lies behind it, to the physics of melanin in skin, to the latest theories of dark matter, along with a perspective informed by history, by politics, and with a little wisdom from Star Trek. She urges us to recognize how science, like most fields, is in fact rife with racism, misogyny, and other forms of oppression. Her insights are challenging, but they are inspiring. The disordered cosmos dreams into existence a world that allows everyone to experience and understand the wonders of the universe. Chanda Prescod Weinstein is one of the leading physicists of her generation and is also one of fewer than 100 Black American women to earn a PhD from a department of physics. Her vision of the cosmos is vibrant, buoyantly non-traditional, and it is grounded in Black and queer feminist lineages. She's an assistant professor of physics at the University of New Hampshire. She wanted to be here with us today, but she has suffered a serious death in her family. Our thoughts and our prayers are with her and her family tonight, and she will be able to celebrate with us on another occasion. And as I say, I'm delighted I'll have the opportunity to engage with her on the Key Conversations podcast. The Ralph Waldo Emerson Prize was established in 1960 to recognize studies that contribute significantly to historical, philosophical, or religious interpretations of the human condition. The winner of the Phi Beta Kappa Ralph Waldo Emerson Award for 2022 is All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley's Sack, a Black family keepsake by Tiya Miles, published by Penguin Random House. In the 1850s in South Carolina, an enslaved woman named Rose faced a crisis: the imminent sale of her daughter Ashley. Thinking quickly, she packed a cotton bag with a few items, and soon the 9-year-old girl was separated from her mother and sold. Decades later, Ashley's granddaughter, Ruth, embroidered this family history on the sack in spare and haunting language. All That She Carried is a poignant story of resilience and love passed down against steep odds. Steep doesn't quite capture it, against unimaginable odds. It honors the creativity, the resourcefulness of people who preserve family ties when official systems refused to do so, and it serves as a visionary illustration of how to reconstruct and recount their stories today. All That She Carried won the National Book Award for Nonfiction and the Penn John Kenneth Galbraith Award for Nonfiction. Professor Miles is the Michael Garvey Professor of History and Radcliffe Alumni Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. She is a recipient of the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship Award and the Hyatt Prize in the Humanities from the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture. She too could not be with us tonight, but I am pleased to present a video of her remarks.
Greetings. My name is Tiya Miles, and I am the author of All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, a Black Family Keepsake, which is a history and a story of enslavement, perseverance, family, Black women, love, creativity, survival, and hope for the future, set in the U.S. Southeast and also the Northeast. I extend my deepest apologies for not being able to be present with you today I am actually out of the country at the time that you are most likely viewing this, but I am extremely grateful and moved and thrilled to have been awarded the Ralph Waldo Emerson Prize from Phi Beta Kappa this year. In receiving this prize, I'm joining a number of scholars who I have admired for quite a long time. And also, and this is quite special to me, in receiving this prize in 2022, I get to stand alongside of, at least virtually, two people whose work I have admired greatly, whose work has illuminated so many important questions about our world, about literature, about the cosmos, about the stars, whose work has actually uplifted me in my own personal life in the past year, and whose work I shared with my twin daughters right as they were turning 18 years old. I am, of course, referring to Professor Farah Jasmine Griffin, a great literary scholar, and Professor Chanda Prescod Weinstein, who is an incredible scientist of so many things that I can't really begin to get my mind around, but she helps me to try. She helps me to make the effort, and I'm so grateful to be sharing this virtual stage with both of them. I am thankful as well to the Secretary of Phi Beta Kappa, Fred Lawrence, and the Executive Assistant to the Secretary, Aurora Sherman, who have made all of this possible. And I would like to thank the readers, the judges, and all of you who are gathered, and to tell you again that I wish I could be with you to celebrate all of this work and to express my thanks in person. Be well, and thank you.
The Christian Gauss Award is the oldest of Phi Beta Kappa's 3 book awards. It was established by the Phi Beta Kappa Senate in 1950 to recognize outstanding books in the field of literary scholarship or criticism. The award is named for the late Christian Gauss, the distinguished Princeton University scholar, teacher, and dean, who also served as a Phi Beta Kappa senator and was one of Peter's predecessors as the president of the Phi Beta Kappa Society. The winning title of the Phi Beta Kappa Christian Gauss Award is Read Until You Understand, The Profound Wisdom of Black Life and Literature by Farah Jasmine Griffin, published by W.W. Norton. In Read Until You Understand, Farah Griffin weaves together her own intellectual journey and a deep engagement with Black American literature and life. We experience her love of the majestic power of words and the magnificence of Black life. Griffin has spent years rooted in the culture of Black genius and the legacy of books left to her by her father, who died when she was 9 years old. A beloved professor, she has devoted herself to passing these works and their wisdom on to generations of students. In reading this book, we are now among those students. She entwines memoir, history, and art while maintaining a powerful sense of the present, asking us to grapple with the continuing struggle for Black freedom and the ongoing, incomplete project that is American democracy. She challenges us to reckon with our commitment to all of the nation's inhabitants and all of our responsibilities to all of humanity. Farah Griffin is the William B. Ransford Professor of English and Comparative Literature and African American Studies at Columbia University, where she has also served as the inaugural chair of the African American and African Diaspora Studies. She is a 2021-22 Guggenheim Fellow and Mellon Foundation Fellow in Residence. Please join me in congratulating and welcome Dr. Farah Griffin.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. I want to thank the Phi Beta Kappa Society. I want to thank everyone who took the time to read my book and to those who selected it for this wonderful recognition. It is so deeply meaningful to me, more than I can actually express this evening. I want to thank my fellow winners, Tiya, who I know, and I actually saw Ashley Sack at the African American Museum here many years ago, and then when I saw that Tiya was writing a book about it, I could think of no one better than a historian of her caliber and a writer of her talent to tell that story, and she has done it extraordinarily well. And I purchased Chanda's book even before I found out she'd won the prize, and it was sitting there on my to-read list, and I thought, I'm going to really read a book about physics. And then when I found out she was also a winner, I began to read it and immediately thought, how on earth can I share this with my students? Can I find a way to teach it and perhaps read it in a study group or something and use it as an excuse to invite her to come to campus so that I can speak with her. I also want to thank the family members and the community about whom I write in this book, people who extended such grace and love and care to me, and in so doing, created the conditions of possibility that bring me before you today. And of those family members, one in particular I extend special gratitude to is my mother, who is 95 years old, still vibrant and still living with us, who guided my education, provided me the necessary space and resources to read, to write, to dream, to believe. And I want to thank all the writers and all of the books that have made their way to the pages of my own. In them, I discovered worlds and ways of knowing that have been life-altering. And finally, I want to thank my brilliant husband, Aubrey Hendricks. We both finished books during the pandemic, and we managed to stay married and to make it through intact, I think relatively intact. Largely because we had each other. So thank you, Aubrey, especially for seeing this book's potential long before I did, for knowing that it would find its place in the world when I doubted it, and for living this life of reading, writing, this life of the mind, but also this life of justice seeking with me. So thank you, everyone.
If he doesn't take this picture, this never really happened.
Oh, okay.
That's it, just one more candid shot, and then we're
Done.
Good.
Okay. All right.
Okay, let's get to work. Well, what a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you very much. And to have the opportunity to engage in a discussion about this remarkable book. I was thinking of something that Donald Murray said when he said that all writing is autobiography. By the way, he also said remembering may be a... Hey, I'm from New York. This stuff happens all the time. He also said remembering may be a celebration or it may be a dagger in the heart, but it is far better than forgetting. How do you think about the roles of criticism, literary criticism on the one hand, autobiography on the other, in Read Until You Understand?
That's a very good question. I think that usually I would think of those as two very separate enterprises, but in Read Until You Understand, they come together. And they come together because I wanted to share my passion for reading. And that passion for reading came from a very autobiographical place. And this is the first book where I explicitly allow my sort of analysis and criticism of the literature to be informed. I think we all allow our analyses to be informed by autobiography, but where I didn't try to push it away, where I allowed my own kind of autobiographical reflections to be part of what I brought to bear on the readings. So I think that's how they work together in the book.
Staying in the autobiographical vein, the title comes from a very moving inscription by your father. Yes. In your copy of Black Struggle by Brian Folks that he gave you. Your father's presence pervades the book, but tell us a little bit about him and the influence and how you see him playing a role through this book.
Well, my father, you know, I often think of him as having been an autodidact, although he was educated. I mean, he received an associate's degree from Temple University, but was a brilliant man, working class man, largely self-taught in many areas, self-taught musician, self-taught painter, self-taught in many areas, a voracious reader, and loved history, and shared that passion with me, but not only with me, with any child who would sit still long enough. You know, I mean, everyone in my family of a certain age learned to read and write from my father. I mean, I think he was a frustrated teacher, and we had gifts of chalkboards and you know, and so all of us learned to read and write. We learned to write our names from him. We learned to read from him. And then after that, you know, we learned to cherish books and trips to the library and things, you know, of those sorts. And so I credit, you know, my interests in learning with the time that I spent with my dad. It was our father-daughter time, daddy-daughter time. It was largely spent reading and talking and, you know, being taught. So it wasn't a chore. And then when he died, when I was 9 years old, I think that learning relationship didn't change. You know, it just became a way of seeking him out. So seeking him out first in the books that he left behind, because there were a house full of books that, you know, probably drove my mother crazy. Anything that could contain books had books that belonged to him. So what used to be a china cabinet was a book, you know, what used to be a clothes closet was full of books. So at first it was seeking him out in the books and the records that he left behind. And then later on, thinking what would he have thought and trying to find those answers in books. And so a kind of haunting throughout. And I think that I wanted to share that with my readers in the book. So that's why he's the kind of sort of presence throughout.
Remember when my mother died, a teacher of mine saying, you can still talk to her, you're just going to have to listen a little harder to hear back. Right. And I think there's a sense of that in Read Until You Understand, that you're still listening to hear that voice coming back. Always
listening, right, and always looking. And fortunately, my father also, he left notebooks, some of them, I lost one of them, unfortunately. I took it away with me to college and put it in storage. And I lost it along with my collection of Shakespeare. So, but I have many notes and scrapbooks and things like that. And so I also had his notes as well. Yeah.
I want to come back to books you've read, books you've written, books that you've written about. But I do want to take a little digression into another part of your life for a moment, and that's music, which I know is very important to you. You wrote that in your house, we didn't turn the music on because it was always on. It was beloved and necessary. It shaped our sense of ourselves as individuals and as a people. Yeah. So talk a little bit about the soundtrack of your young life and how it shaped your identity as a person and as a member of a people.
Well, I think it was so ubiquitous that I took it for granted, and it wasn't until much later on that I realized how meaningful it was. you know, and so I was writing this book about books, and there's a point in the middle of the book where I say, okay, wait a minute, like, there was something that was more important to us than books, and that was music, but it was because you didn't have to go look for the music, it was always there. And the soundtrack, in my home, inside my home, the soundtrack was jazz, because my father was a jazz head. And so that's what was playing all the time. And it was mostly Miles Davis of a certain period, pre-Bitches Brew Miles Davis. John Coltrane, you know, a lot of bebop, you know, and then the vocalists, Billie Holiday, Sarah Vaughan. Gloria Lynn is the first vocalist I remember hearing. But then there were these sort of intergenerational sounds. So my older cousins, Motown, and then later on Earth, Wind and Fire, and Stevie Wonder and Marvin Gaye. And I had an aunt who loved organ trios, and another aunt who was really hip and listened to Patti LaBelle. Well, before Patti LaBelle, she's not so hip anymore. But it was when she was LaBelle, right? Night, you know, and you'd go to a LaBelle concert and they'd dress in silver. I remember all of that, and so you know, there was something about your identity was said about the kind of music you listen to. So the soundtrack at home was one thing, but the soundtrack at family gatherings was another thing. Yeah.
Did you, well, in retrospect, do you think of it as another text that you were exposed to and that was influencing you?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in the chapter where I talk about music, I think it's a way of also showing the kind of critical intellectual engagement that people had with the music. So in that chapter, I'm talking about my family had a small little restaurant, and it had a jukebox, and how engaged they were with the sort of aesthetic changes that happened in the music of Stevie Wonder or Marvin Gaye as they became more political, and engaging the sound of that music as well as the lyrics, and what that meant, you know, both for the musicians but also for African American people. And they really did a kind of exegesis of the lyrics in the way that someone might do of a biblical text even. So yes, I think it was another text, and a text that informed the way people gave meaning to their lives.
And just staying with music, now taking you know, further into your life, you've worked with Jerry Allen.
Yes.
I don't know if you think of that. Well, tell us first of all a little bit about that. If you think of that as part of your scholarly work, is that something different from that, or is that not a distinction that we can make?
Yeah, the older I get, the more difficult it always was difficult, but I guess I'm being honest about it. I don't really separate those two things. They all are extensions of each other. So Jerry Allen, you know, late Jerry Allen, dear friend, brilliant pianist and composer. She actually, I came to her, I was a fan of her music, and it turns out she was a fan of my scholarship. She had a master's degree in ethnomusicology, and she read voraciously about the music. And she invited me, because of my scholarship, to collaborate with her. So I have a book that I wrote on Billie Holiday, and then I also wrote a book on 3 women artists in the 1940s, one of whom was the composer, pianist Mary Lou Williams. And so she invited me to write a script for a show about Mary Lou, that she wanted to do Mary Lou's music, very complicated, difficult music. So the scholarship and the creative writing that I did for Jerry's music and with Jerry in collaboration with her, they were all kind of in conversation with each other. Yeah.
And you didn't say that's a kind of creative work, that's not what I do something different. You said that's a challenge I want to take on.
Absolutely. I think because I always considered myself a writer first. Before I knew what an academic was, I was a writer before I had any sense of what an academic did. In high school, I thought of myself as a writer. And so Jerry, I think, also saw in me and read, she read my work and she saw the writer in me. Mm-hmm. So I felt that she was calling me to stop separating those two things and to bring them together, to insist that I bring them together. And so she provided me the opportunity to do just that. I mean, it was something that I had wanted to do.
It's all different kinds of teaching,
yes.
Right? Different audiences and different texts, but it's all about teaching.
And that's what she would say. She'd say, we want to teach, except our classroom is going to be the Apollo stage. And what I knew in that classroom is exactly what I know in my own classroom, is that the people in that audience had as much to teach me as I had to teach them, and they did. I mean, these are people who were aficionados of the music and felt very, very confident in telling me what I got wrong. So, yeah.
So I got to ask what it feels like to be doing a gig at the Apollo Theater.
It's
right?
extraordinary.
I mean, you've got to feel the generations behind you when you're there. You got to feel that you're both at one with them, judged by them, maybe a little bit, whether you measure up or not.
It feels magnificent. It feels, but I think you feel like you're on hallowed ground. Mm-hmm. It felt very sacred. And the thing about the Apollo that was so fascinating is that all the talent there, the stagehands were so talented that they didn't even need the artists to come early to do the sound check because they could play every instrument. They were just incredible. It was just an incredible experience. And I'm very grateful that I took the risk to step outside of my, normal setting to do that work.
Get some of the butterflies going in the tummy, and that's a good feeling,
yes,
right?
Right, absolutely.
So speaking of butterflies in the tummy, you go off to Harvard College
yes.
And study with the great Werner Solars.
Yes.
And tell us what that transition was like from the reading you'd done, the sort of autodidact role that you'd played in the wake of your father's lessons, right. And then going off in the fairly early Afro-American studies program at Harvard still at that point.
Right. So I had read African-American authors on my own. And I had a very good public school education, a magnet school in Philadelphia, and then later on got a scholarship to attend an all-girls private school in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, where I fell in love with the canon and learned how to read literature critically, but did not read texts by Black authors. And then when I got to Harvard, Werner came, I think, my sophomore year. Harvard stole him from Columbia. And it was the first time I ever took a class in African American literature by a German professor who had studied African American literature in Germany and said that that's what made American literature to him, was African American literature. He wrote his dissertation on Amiri Baraka. And it was fascinating. It just, to believe that this thing that I loved suddenly could be an area of study, a formal area of academic study. You know this experience, right? And it's just, and you're at the beginning, as you said, the beginning of this development of this field that's gaining legitimacy. So you actually feel like there's a project that you can participate in, helping to create the formal study of African American literature on the university level. And Werner was central to that for me.
Did there come a point when you thought to yourself, if I can pull this off, this is what I want to do? I want to, if I can answer Uncle John's question, that I can make this work, right? I can pay the rent, that this is what I want to do.
Yeah, so I thought I was going to go to law school. And
nothing wrong with that.
Right, I planned to go. Right. I'd had a wonderful mentor, and I thought I was going to go to law school, but I still wanted to be a writer, so I thought I'd go to law school, but I'd write on the side. And then Werner and another professor, Nathan Huggins, told me to think about going to graduate school. And I didn't even know what that meant. Like, what does that mean? What do you do? You go to graduate school. Is that what professors do? And then I thought it was so self-indulgent that I would spend my life doing what I loved. Like, I thought, who does that? Nobody does that. you know, but then when I realized that I could, I never looked back. I have been so grateful that I actually could make a living doing the things that I loved, you know.
Just in fairness to the law part, before we leave that altogether, the reference that you made to a mentor in the law, I assume you mean the great Leon Higginbotham, who was a distinguished United States Court of Appeals judge on the Third Circuit in Philadelphia, and one of the leading legal historians, really, of his generation at Penn Law School. Tell us a little bit about your mentee relationship with the great Judge Higginbotham.
Yes, I have a friend who read this book, and he said, you know, you're sort of like Forrest Gump. You know, he said, you just appear in places and meet people. So when I was in Philadelphia, there was an organization founded by a man named David Evans, and it was a larger kind of civil rights organization that had a mentoring project attached to it. And it was a citywide program for young people, young African Americans mostly, to introduce them to the professions. And you would go and maybe intern for a doctor, or if you needed academic enrichment, you might get tutors, or you'd intern after school for a lawyer. And Judge Higginbotham, who lived in Philadelphia and worked on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, would always take in a student, a high school student. And he always took in these like promising young men who went to Central High School, if you know Philadelphia. It's the major academic high school at that time for boys. And I was placed with him. I was the first girl who was placed in his office. And I answered phones, and I could type on a real typewriter. My mother made me learn how to type. So I would type things, and I'd answer phones, and because I love books, he let me catalog his library. And I wanted to be like him. I wanted to be, you know, I thought I want to be a great lawyer, a great jurist, but he was also a great historian. And so I would sometimes work at the courthouse, but sometimes work at the University of Pennsylvania doing research. And it was the research part that I really fell in love with. And I was about 16 or 17 when I started working for him. And he just became a very, very important figure in my life, well beyond that formal internship.
Did he have a rooting interest in your career path, or he just wanted to further where you were going?
He just was very supportive of me. He took an interest, and you know, I mean, he thought I was going to go to law school too. And then at one point I told him that I thought maybe I didn't want, well, I applied to law school. I got in, I deferred law school for 2 years. And then I told him, I don't think I want to do this. And he said, that's okay, you don't have to do it. And so I followed his wife's trajectory instead of his, and it worked out fine. Yeah.
The list of extraordinarily gifted humanists who had a brief brush with law school. Proust had an unhappy experience briefly in law school. Cézanne had a brief experience briefly in law school. My wife would not forgive me if I didn't mention Henry James had a brief and unsuccessful experience in law school. What's the common thread here that creative people say that's enough about law school, and they find it?
But they're all attracted to it at some point.
There
so
you are. That's right. So. That's right. Thank you, Larry. There's one other person in the room who gets me. Thank you. So we talked at the beginning about the sort of genre-defying aspect of your work of autobiography and criticism. I want to take another pass at that genre-defying, and that is the difference between the distant critic and the involved, engaged critic. You describe teaching A Lesson Before Dying, Ernest Gaines' book, in your class, and an excerpt from Jefferson's diary that you have them read out loud. And here's what you said. Although in my classes we approach our reading of them as clear-headed, critical thinkers, these pages, which I have my students read aloud so they can hear the poetry, never fail to bring tears to our eyes. I noticed you didn't say their eyes, you said our eyes. Then later you say the power of literature is to use language to remind us of another's humanity by touching our own. So what's the role of the clear-headed critical thinker, and what's the role of the one who allows herself to cry?
Well, I think we all have to, part of the training is to be that clear-headed critical thinker, and there are all kinds of ways of gaining and acquiring that distance. Zora Neale Hurston famously said that anthropology gave her that distance that she needed to understand her own culture, right? She said it was a spyglass. And so we have methodologies and all of those ways of reading and knowing that give us the necessary distance. And as teachers, we train our students to read that way. And I'm constantly, and that's the way, as critics, we read. But, when I'm have my students read that passage out loud, part of what we're doing in that classroom is that we're experiencing each other's humanity together. And I cannot read that passage and hold back the tears. I cannot do it. And I know very few people, if you know that book, who can. And I think it's perfectly fine for my students to see their teacher in that vulnerable moment, and to allow them to experience it in that way. That's perfectly fine. And then we can pull it together and sit back and take a deep breath and talk about why we just felt that way. And was that a manipulation of our emotions? Did that author manipulate us? What happened there in that moment that we shared? And so I think it's a place of creating a degree of comfort with being all of who we are and bringing all of who we are to the page. Yeah.
I know that Toni Morrison is very important to you. The book is dedicated to Toni Morrison. Heard an interview with her in which, reacting to Baldwin's famous comment that we're all writing for the little white man, the white man inside our gut, inside our stomach, and she said, you got to knock the white man off your shoulder. I'm not writing for the white. Not writing for the white man, which is not, and she doesn't mean she's not right about white characters. Obviously she writes about white characters. But I take her to be saying Tolstoy didn't feel he had to define things for non-Russian readers, and she's not going to do that for readers outside her community. So is Baldwin right, or is Morrison right?
I always say I'm a Morrisonian.
One could do worse.
Yeah. I think that they were both right for different reasons. Baldwin had a different project, and in many ways, Toni could have the project she had because Baldwin had the project that he had. And she knew that. She knew that she was indebted to him. There's an essay that she writes for him, and she says, "You gave me a language to dwell in." And so I think she knew that, and she plays with that in the novel Home. She actually literally has a character, a little man, who she makes that person, that critic, someone who she does get rid of, and she sees him there. But I think what she's talking about, she's not talking about white readers. She's talking about the person for whom you are constantly adjusting, like what might they think. If I write about a black person in this way, might they think this about them? And therefore, it's constantly policing oneself. And so she says, once I don't do that, once I stop doing that, then I can write about everything. It's all possible, right? And so that's what I think it is. I think that they are both right, and that one, it's almost kind of an evolution to what becomes possible, and also what you're imagining as an audience.
Talk to us a little bit about mercy. You talk a lot about the role of mercy in the book. You end that chapter on the rather provocative note, perhaps it's better to strike a blow for freedom than to rely on mercy. But how do you understand the relationship between mercy and grace, and where does that all fit in the blow for freedom, in the fight for freedom?
I think that, the book leaves, for me, as many questions as answers. And I always knew that it would kind of start with mercy and end with grace. I sort of knew that. I didn't know what would come in between. So the question of mercy there is prompted by a number of things. It's prompted by the various definitions of mercy. One being, if you are in the power, if you're in the position to have power and authority over someone, and you choose to be kind, and you choose to be humane toward them, then that is acting mercifully. Or if someone is to not get punishment that they have earned, that they should get, then that is an act of mercy, right? And that can be an act of mercy on the part of one person to another, a criminal justice system to people, or it can be an act of mercy of the divine, right? So there are all those different kinds of mercies that are at play there. And one of the questions for that chapter is what raises it for me is there's an autobiographical and a literary one. The autobiographical one is I think that the circumstances of my father's death are circumstances, without giving away much of the book, where an act of mercy could have been granted to him or granted to my mother and myself, and it was not. And yet, following his death, our community granted a great deal of mercy toward us. So that's the autobiographical. The literary example is when Phyllis Wheatley says in her most famous poem, "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land." And I always read that from the first time I ever read it, and I thought, what did she do to need mercy? She's the enslaved child. She's 7 years old. Like, what did she do? Why does she need mercy? Why don't the people who enslave her need mercy? And so it's just a series of messy questions about mercy. And grace, I think, is because it's just my favorite concept. Like, it's just unrequited reward. I mean, we don't do anything to earn it. It's just given to us. And the question that I end with, or that I ask there, is not so much a question of divine grace given to us by the divine, but what would it mean for us to be conduits of grace to each other as just a way of being in the world? So, long question to your, long answer to your question.
Wonderful, yeah. Rich answer. I love your discussion of Frederick Douglass, but in particular, I mean, there are many faces of Frederick Douglass. Yours is a very hopeful Douglass, the Douglass who says the Constitution is a great liberty document. And you say perhaps movement building requires hope. And maybe that's what Douglass had in mind, right? This is the Douglass who, after the Civil War, is going to be a movement builder. So have you written a hopeful book, do you think?
I think so. I mean, someone accused me recently who read it, that she's like, where's the hope? There's no hope in this book. But I think in an age that is actually full of pessimism, so much so that it's a kind of dominant intellectual trend in African American studies now, I don't think that this is a pessimistic book. It is a book that believes in a tomorrow, that there is a tomorrow worth fighting for, and that believes that even if we lose, it is our responsibility to fight, and that there is transformation in the struggle. And so, to me, that's hopeful. And I think that I talked about being at heart a writer, but I'm also at heart a teacher. And it's we were talking about that, like, when people say, oh, we'll give you this administrative responsibility and you don't have to teach, that is like, why would I not want to teach? I mean, I don't mind the administrative, I can do that, but teaching is what gives me joy. And I don't see how you can be a person lacking in hope if you're committed to teaching, right? Teaching, there has to be, even if I'm not Pollyanna-ish, but yes, I think there's a hopeful. It ends in a garden, so there's some hope.
I want to come back to the garden. I want to end on the garden too. But I've one question before that, and there, we were joking with our sound technician. We said, "How long are you going to talk for?" And I said, 30, 35 minutes, 6 hours at the outside. And goodness knows there's so much in this wonderful book that we could continue to probe for. And so if I got one more, I do want to ask you about justice.
Yeah.
And about the concept of justice. And you talk about retributive justice, you talk about God's justice, you talk about the justice of the street and the community's justice, and the aspiration of transformational justice. So tell us a little bit about your thoughts on how justice is, in some measure, an organizing theme of this book, but also how it runs through Richard Wright, it runs through Gaines, it runs through Toni Morrison and all of her work, really.
So I taught a class, several iterations of a class that I called African American Novelists and the Quest for Justice. And initially it was going to be African American novelists and the concept of justice. And then I realized that it was really an ongoing quest, and that in none of the novels that I taught was there ever the achievement of justice, ever. But there was never the sense that one stopped in the quest for it. And my students also, they shaped and informed that class. I mean, some of them, and this was a class that started out with, believe it or not, Aeschylus and the Old Testament, because I couldn't teach the writers who I wanted to teach without teaching that, because they were responding to Aeschylus in the Old Testament too, conceptions of justice.
Right. You better read what they read.
Yes.
In order to understand
In order to
them.
Understand what
Right.
what their contributions, what they're fighting with, and then all of those forms of justice start to play. So in Richard Wright, the criminal justice system is not going to be the place where anybody's going to get justice in that novel, and yet there's some potential between two human beings to recognize and see each other as human beings that suggests there's some possibility for a just society. And by the time you get to Morrison, there's not even a courtroom scene. She doesn't even do that, right? Like why? It's just gone, right?
Right.
Like why even have the courtroom scene? And that any form of justice is going to be a sense of restorative justice, and it might not even be, the perpetrator. Nothing is going to hold him accountable. So then what happens to you, the person who has been victimized? And how do we take care of the person who's been victimized? And that's a different way of thinking about justice and what a just society looks like. So I think that's, and it's in a different iteration of the book, it might have ended at justice, but when I realized that this is an ongoing quest, it was one in a series of values and concepts, not the end, but one of many values that I wanted to hold up.
I was struck by the audible aspect of the book. I don't mean reading it aloud, although it would certainly stand up as that as well. Yeah. But there are a lot of sounds in this book.
Yeah.
Right? Music, but also anger, violence, the argument for freedom, the sounds in the streets. And it ends in a quiet place.
Yes.
It ends in a garden. It ends in a garden early on in the pandemic.
Yeah.
Tell us about flowers and gardens.
So I sort of always knew that it was going to end in the garden, or end around flowers, and I knew it was going to end with grace. And I think it's because I love flowers, and the women in my family were urban gardeners. And I saw that as just trying to squeeze a bit of beauty out of, a life that was not necessarily beautiful, right? But I also thought that the idea, if Chanda were here, she would, help explain this to me. But, of course, there's a scientific reason behind the beauty and the variety and the shape of flowers. Of course, I know this. But every time I see a flower, I just think it's a gift of grace. You know, I didn't do anything to deserve that. I did nothing to deserve that beautiful peony that, or whatever it is. It's just, and I think that, you know, I want it to end on a sense of life in which one finds beauty and hope and grace in the most mundane way, the quotidian. And in the pandemic, I think there's a reason why many people turn to gardens, you know. And this book ends both in the pandemic, the height of the pandemic, but also the height of the protests for George Floyd. And with my mother in her garden, thinking about both of those things. And so I wanted to leave us with that sense of possibility.
Sense of possibility, sense of hope, sense of grace.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
In the introduction to the book, you set out for us the aspiration that we will view this as the beginning of a curriculum. And if you have not read all of the authors who are in the book, and I suspect many of your readers have not, you say that perhaps they will want to pull some of those books off the shelf, and I'm telling you that you will. So I wish you happy reading with this book. I wish you, the opportunity to engage with all of our authors tonight. And before we part tonight, and before I send you on your way, we do have a little tradition here. You know, at other events that you've been at, of course, they have a drawing for who gets to take home the flowers. Well, this is Phi Beta Kappa. You get to take home the books. So, I have here a Phi Beta Kappa cap. These are suitable for purchase for anyone who wants to buy a Phi Beta Kappa cap. Absolutely. So if you look on your place card, you will see that you have a number. And I'm gonna ask Farah to pick out a number, and which we do them in the order of the prizes. Are there the ones that are on top? Well, let's start with the book you've just heard about. So, just pick one out and read us the number. Number 3. So whoever has 3 gets a copy of Read Until You Understand. We have a winner at each table. Now, it turns out that the author's husband happens to have number 3, so suffice it to say, we believe in the free market here. You can trade books with people if you want to. There is a gray market for our books here. Okay, so Sudab came up with number 3. All right, well that means you better get to work reading. Okay, all right. Our next will be the Emerson Prize volume. Right, all that she carried, and those holding number
5.
Number 5. Number 5. Okay, we have 5s. And last but most certainly not least, the extraordinary voyage into Star Trek, the Beyond, and the Outer Space. Those holding? The suspense is killing me.
Number 2.
Number 2.
They're all signed.
But the truth is, as you all know, by having been privileged to hear our author tonight, everybody is a winner tonight. Thank you all for joining us. Have a safe trip home.